Hello, my name is Scott Rodilitz. I'm going to be presenting on some joint work with Vahideh Manshadi and Niazadeh called Fair Dynamic Rationing. And our goal in this work is to shed some light on how to responsibly allocate inadequate supply to sequentially arriving demand. This is a general class of allocation problems that arise frequently in a variety of publicly, socially important applications. And to give you just one example, let's take a step back in time, a little more than a year, to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. So in early April, states were predicting that they were going to have significant amount of need for medical supplies. This need was going to arrive sequentially. Some states were going to be hit earlier than other states. And their needs were going to be correlated due to network effects. If the pandemic was worse in New York, New Jersey, it was probably also going to be worse in Pennsylvania and Connecticut and Massachusetts. So this presents a pretty challenging problem for organizations that are in charge of supplying states with critical medical supplies. As one example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency took control of the national stockpile and was in charge of distributing that in some capacity. Now, but what they faced was a pretty challenging problem because, first, this supply was not designed to support a nationwide simultaneous emergency, and so the supply was inadequate to meet demand. But even still, demand was to a great extent unknown. It was not certain what the need would be in New Jersey, and then later in Connecticut, and then later in Tennessee. Now, these demands, like we said, not only were they unknown and sequential, but they're also presumably correlated to some degree. And so FEMA faced a pretty challenging problem of deciding how to ration supply when New Jersey needed some ICU beds, but Tennessee in the future was likely going to need some as well. Now, these types of problems arise, as I said, in a variety of contexts, including for natural disasters, mobile food pantries, as well as all sorts of rationing public good problems. So what can you do? Well, one simple, efficient approach is a first-come, first-served policy. Now, unfortunately, this is very unfair. If you're someone in Tennessee who's going to be relying on medical supplies, it seems unfair for FEMA to leave you essentially hanging out to dry. On the other hand, achieving equity is also by itself pretty easy. We could just give no one anything. Now, of course, this would leave people even more angry than a first come, first served policy. But it begs the question of how we can balance efficiency and equity in a rationing policy. And to try to answer that question, we first develop a framework. So suppose we have, without loss of generality, one unit of a divisible good, so we've got some supply, and we have a sequence of demands which are arbitrarily correlated coming from some known distribution. And the planner observes the demand of agent I and then decides on an allocation at that point without knowing the future demand, other than knowing that it's drawn from this distribution. Now, an agent's utility is going to be given by their fill rate. So it's the amount of their demand that they receive. Now, this allocation can't exceed their demand, so the fill rate is going to be bounded by 1. And our goal is going to be to maximize the minimum fill rate. Now, I've put this in quotes to emphasize that this is still somewhat poorly defined. It's a random process, so there's a question of when to take the expectation. We're talking about the expected minimum fill rate or the minimum expected fill rate. So that corresponds to ideas of ex post and ex-ante fill rates. So we're going to focus a little bit more in this talk on the ex post minimum fill rate. It's essentially thinking about fairness in terms of outcomes rather than fairness in terms of expected outcomes. So just as one example, a policy which is ex-ante fair can be unfair along every sample path. And many of the motivating applications that we have in mind are rare events, and so we prefer to be fair in outcomes as opposed to expected outcomes. Now, by Jensen's inequality, ex post fairness represents a lower bound on ex ante. So focusing on ex post comes with fairly minimal loss, and as we'll show later, the policy that we have in mind performs quite well on both metrics. Like I said, our goal is to design policies that maximize mostly the ex post minimum fill rate. If it also performs well in terms of the ex ante minimum fill rate, that would be cool. All right, so before getting into some of our results, I want to talk about some related work just briefly. So what we've done is related to some degree in fairness in static allocation, where everything's known at once and you have just a one-shot decision to make. There's also some work on fairness in dynamic allocation, which is a little bit more similar to our approach. And then our methodology is more related to online resource allocation and profit inequalities. Okay. So before getting into our policy, any sort of results, I want to start by asking you to think about how you would allocate if the demand sequence was deterministic. Okay. So if the demand sequence is deterministic, a proportional allocation policy would maximize both the ex post and the ex ante minimum fill rate, essentially giving everyone an allocation proportional to their demand. So this is going to achieve a fill rate of either 1 if demand is low, or 1 over mu, 1 over the total demand, if demand exceeds our supply, as it is likely to do in these cases. So the question we want to ask is, what can we hope for, what can we achieve when demand is stochastic as opposed to deterministic? And to answer this question, we're going to formalize notions of fairness guarantees. We're going to say that a policy achieves an ex post fairness guarantee if for any demand sequence with n agents and expected total demand of mu, the ex post minimum fill rate is greater than some function kappa times this deterministic normalization, right? If the expected total demand is quite large, we're not going to be able to hope for a good ex post minimum fill rate. So we want to separate out the impacts of supply scarcity from the impacts of stochasticity and correlation in demand. Now the same idea is going to hold for our definition of ex-ante fairness guarantees. And note that this kappa function is parameterized by both the expected total demand, or this supply scarcity level, as well as the number of agents. So the question is, what fraction of this deterministic normalization, what fraction can we hope to achieve? Now we'll start with the bad news. It turns out that no sequential policy can achieve ex post fairness guarantee better than this somewhat complicated equation. So we've shown it here again, parameterized by the supply scarcity and the number of agents, but it's probably more helpful to look at it in a comparative statics sense. So here on the right, you'll see the ex post fairness guarantee achievable when n is 1, when n is 2, when n is 4, and as n, the number of agents approaches infinity, as a function of the supply scarcity level. I'll make a couple of notes. First, for any fixed supply scarcity, this bound is decreasing in the number of agents. That should make sense, as you have to make more sequential decisions that can, again, involve some correlated demand. This problem gets harder. Now, this upper bound is non-monotonic in the supply scarcity for a fixed number of agents. But once the supply scarcity is large enough, this upper bound does become constant, again, for a fixed number of agents. I also want to emphasize that this upper bound is always at least 1/2 of our deterministic normalization of this 1 or 1 over mu, where mu is this supply scarcity level, or the total expected demand to supply ratio. Now, where does this bad news come from? Where do these upper bounds come from? Well, to give you some sense, we can look at one example from the family of instances that give us this parameterized upper bound. And so this example on the left is the example when there are 3 agents and when the supply scarcity level is high, when demand is expected to be high relative to supply. And what we have are three equally likely scenarios. And so if you're designing an online policy, it needs to make a decision in this first period after observing a demand of mu over 2, without knowing which of the three scenarios we're in, without knowing what the future demand is going to hold. And so when you make that decision in the first period, it's easy to make a suboptimal decision. And so no online policy is going to make the perfect decision because it doesn't know which scenario we're in. Even in the second period, if we observe a demand, we still won't know whether we're in scenario 2 or scenario 3. And so again, we're not necessarily going to be able to make an optimal decision. And so examples such as this, where there are scenarios that are equally likely, provide a lot of challenges for online decision makers. And I want to emphasize this is not pathological. You can think of an example of a hurricane impacting coastal towns as it continues on this destructive path. And the question we need to answer is, will this hurricane veer off to sea, or is it going to continue? And how should we budget our limited disaster response resources without knowing how many towns are going to be impacted? And so given that that there are practical examples that are similar to these bad instances, which give us our upper bounds, it's important to design policies that perform well even in these instances. Now, luckily, we're able to do exactly that. The main result of our paper is to design a simple and adaptive policy that exactly achieves our upper bounds for any supply scarcity level and for any number of agents. And the policy that does this is what we call our projected proportional allocation policy, or PPA. Now, the way this policy works is fairly intuitive. Now, recall what you would do if demand was deterministic, right? You would take your full supply and you would allocate it proportionally based on total demand. Now, here we don't know total demand in advance, but we do have some information about what we expect demand to be. And so we simply replace future demands by their expectations, conditional on what we've observed so far, and then we allocate proportionally. So for example, in the first period, we're going to allocate D1 divided by D1 plus the expected demand, conditional on observing D1. And we're going to allocate that fraction of our supply to this first agent. Now for the second agent, we're going to have lost some amount of our initial supply, but we're still going to allocate proportionally based on the remaining expected future demand. Now I want to emphasize that this policy is adaptive, and we'll come back to that because it is an important feature of our policy. But I also want to emphasize that our policy is simple, it's transparent, and it requires minimal distributional knowledge. All we need to know are conditional first moments. And so these three features are particularly important when you're allocating public goods. People get upset in many cases if the allocation process is not transparent. And if it requires significant amounts of distributional knowledge, it's not going to necessarily be clear how you're making these decisions. And so it's very nice that we have a policy that has these three desirable features and yet also theoretically achieves the best possible ex post fairness guarantee. Now, another policy which achieves the best possible ex post fairness guarantee is the optimum online policy. Now, of course, this is going to do as well or better than our PPA policy, but I want to highlight a few drawbacks of this optimum online policy. Now, first, it's not going to be simple, it's not going to be transparent, and of course, it's going to require full distributional knowledge, all of which can prove controversial when allocating scarce public goods. Now, of course, even calculating this optimum online can be computationally intractable. When you have this correlation structure, the dynamic program that you would need to solve can be exponential in size. So it's not necessarily something that we're able to do, but even if we could, there are some downsides to following the optimum online instead of this simple PPA policy. As one additional piece of evidence in favor of our PPA policy, note that all I've talked about so far is this ex post fairness guarantee. Now, of course, we've highlighted that we think that's the more important of the two, and it provides a lower bound on ex-ante fairness guarantees. But let's take a moment to talk about ex-ante fairness. Okay, so our notion of an ex-ante fairness guarantee is pretty similar to our notion of ex-post fairness guarantee. It's again going to be parameterized by the supply scarcity level, mu, as well as by the number of agents, n, and it's also going to be relative to this deterministic normalization, which depends on how much we expect to be over-demanded. Now, what we're able to show in the paper is that our PPA policy not only achieves the best possible ex-post fairness guarantee, it also achieves the best possible ex-ante fairness guarantee. Now, one thing that makes our PPA policy so effective is its adaptation, its adaptiveness, as it sees more and more demands. It's able to adjust, which accounts for potential correlation in demands. Now, this is particularly important, and to emphasize that, let's take a look at some non-adaptive policies, and in particular, a class of policies that are commonly used in practice, which we call target fill rate policies. And these types of policies predetermine a threshold, which is essentially the fill rate that it wants to achieve for all agents. As demands are revealed, it either allocates that fraction of an agent's demand, or it allocates everything that it has left. Once it's out of supply, agents get nothing. So this can be potentially unfair to the late arriving agents. And in addition, its ex post fairness guarantee is lower than that of PPA policy for any number of agents. We're able to exactly characterize the ex post fairness guarantee achievable by the optimal target fill rate policy using a somewhat surprising connection to a monopoly pricing problem. Now, TFR policies do satisfy some of the many desirable properties that our PPA policy satisfies. They're simple, they're transparent, and they require also minimal distribution knowledge. Here, they just need the full joint distribution as opposed to individual demand information. But because they perform worse than our PPA policy, we want to advocate for this adaptive PPA approach. To provide a bit more evidence for that, let's take a quick look at a case study returning to our motivating example of rationing COVID-19 medical supplies. So here we're going to focus on a demand model used by the White House at that time. We're going to use projected need for ICU beds as a proxy for general demand for medical supplies. We're going to partition states into 4 groups based on when their peak demand is expected to occur, and we're going to treat each of those groups as an individual agent. I want to emphasize that in this demand model, there was no distributional information given, just a little bit, a 5th percentile, a 95th percentile, and an expected demand. So that's something that fits nicely with our framework, but makes it impossible to solve a dynamic program. So to be able to compare our policy against a DP approach, we're going to assume a normal distribution, and we're going to consider different levels of correlation. And I want to emphasize that our policy performs significantly above its guarantee, significantly above the optimal TFR policy, and essentially equivalently to the dynamic programming solution. Now, it achieves this performance despite being much simpler, more transparent, and does not need this distributional information or assumptions. All right, so we've talked about some of the allocative challenges that governmental and nonprofit agencies face and tried to give this problem a fairly holistic treatment. We looked at how to achieve dual goals of equity and efficiency, even in the face of correlated demand. And it turns out that all we need is a simple and transparent policy, which we call PPA. In the paper, we take a look at some extensions, including rationing multiple types of resources and generalizing our objective function. So feel free to check that out or ask if you have any questions. Thanks so much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.